Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Hansel Haywood, and I am a yoga instructor and a writer from southeastern Kentucky. I've also worked as a teacher most of my life in many aspects, whether it be through my spiritual practice or even as a middle school teacher or community advocacy. I've also worked in nonprofit radio. So, a lot of what I saw through my work with the community and a lot of what I'm still seeing is that those of us in this line of work can oftentimes feel like we're bumping heads all the time with our colleagues, or we can feel like we're just spinning our wheels and nothing is really happening. For every few steps forward, we feel like we're taking a few steps back. And so I wanted to share with you some of what I've found, ways that my current work in yoga and embodiment can really assist us in the self care that we need and even the care of our organizations and our colleagues as a collective to make our work more effective and to help prevent us from burning out. So, the title of my presentation today is Body Truth, utilizing the common language of the body for personal growth and community advocacy. So, give me just a second and I will show you the screen big here. So, again, we're talking about body truth, utilizing the common language of the body for personal growth and community advocacy. When we change ourselves, our values and actions change as well. When we do work in the world, internal issues arise that we must face or be rendered ineffective. If we are not addressing the feelings and the emotions that our work brings up or brings out in us, then we're going to find ourselves encountering the same obstacles over and over. And it almost seems like fate. But if we do the work to change ourselves, to work through these issues that we may be having, we'll start to find new ways to then conduct that work in the world. And so, looking at this through the lens of our body and our experience in our body, because that's something that we all have, can be a really great gateway into how we can do this work on ourselves while also doing work in the world. So, a lot of what we experience in the field of community service, whatever aspect we're working in, that is the idea of burnout. And burnout has just been a more recent phenomenon. When we were working more closely to the land and for sustenance, we didn't really have that issue that has been defined and identified quite like this. So it's defined as a syndrome of physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a reduced personal accomplishment that can occur among individuals who work with people in some capacity. It's almost like no matter how hard we try, our work is never finished. So, when we're thinking about how we're working with people and the human experience here, we want to remember that everyone experiences trauma. Augusto Boal said, "The smallest incidents of our social life contain all the moral and political values of society, all its structures of domination and power, all its mechanisms of oppression." Regardless of any privileges we may or may not possess in life, we have and will experience events and stresses that the body and the mind can translate as trauma. These experiences can affect how we interpret the events of our daily lives and our ability to effectively work and communicate with others. Our bodies are designed to create patterns of physiology and behavior based upon inputs from environments and events we have been exposed to in the past in order to keep us safe and successful in the future. So, while it is very effective in the primal sense, in a more cognitive aspect, it can be counterproductive and perceived as a threat or instability. And It may not always be an actual one. So therefore, we become hypervigilant in that we feel that we need to protect ourselves from possible dangers, whether or not they actually exist. So, for example, having experienced some social traumas in my life, sometimes depending on, maybe I'm fatigued or just not feeling my best that day, I can go out and be getting ready to go into the grocery store and feel as if I'm about to have a panic attack because I might have to say hello to someone that I know. That is not a real danger. But in my body, the way that my body is responding to that in a stressful way, it doesn't know if that my body doesn't know if that is a real threat or just one that I am making up. So we're in this state of hypervigilance when we're experiencing those things. And some of us can walk around like that most of the time. Trauma exists for each of us, regardless of our conscious perception of it, or whether or not we would classify an event as being inherently traumatic. It's a neurological response. So here we see there are two types of trauma. We have big T or acute trauma. It's event related. It's associated with PTSD. So major upsets like experiencing war, experiencing a major accident, witnessing a murder, for example, can all be seen as big T trauma. It's an event related. The next one is little t trauma, and it's chronic. So it's something that just because we're alive, most of us, all of us, in my opinion, will experience little t trauma. And it's environmentally related. It can include adverse childhood events or ACEs, accumulation of very stressful situations while developing through childhood or life in general. Microaggressions based on social interactions. So, microaggressions being like feeling as if you come into a room and there's no place to sit because no one is making eye contact with you for whatever reason it might be. Uh, just small things, minor picking and bullying can be seen as microaggressions, and they're based on social interactions. Then we can also look at our historical and cultural trauma related to things such as sexual orientation, race, socioeconomic status, and gender. It can be argued that our predisposed epigenetic responses to stressors can play a role in little t trauma. So, epigenetic responses are those that we inherit from the trauma that our ancestors experienced. So, they pass these patterns down to us so that when we are triggered by trauma, we will immediately be more effective in dealing with it. However, again, this may be real or perceived trauma. So, does it serve us or is it causing an issue? And this is associated with complex PTSD or CPTSD. And this trauma is more often unconscious to us. We wouldn't say necessarily that we had experienced a trauma. So ultimately, we are responsible for and can only directly work on our own personal growth in regard to how our traumas affect our lives. Yet, understanding the impact it has on our own life can help us more readily reach others through our work in our communities. We can use these principles to look at communities and cultures as a whole in order to better understand root or traditional structures and belief systems within the community and how to effectively navigate those to bring positive results in areas of crisis. Before we can do this, though, we have to begin by working on ourselves. You've probably heard the idea that one of the best ways to learn is through teaching, remembering that you're never not a student. You learn from the student as much as they learn from you if this is a good working relationship. Same way with working with the communities. They have to be able to inform your work. You need to be working on yourself as you're expecting the community to work as a whole. So remember, as Matt Kahn says here, despite how open, peaceful, loving you attempt to be, People can only meet you as deeply as they have met themselves. So, how do we start to look at our traumas and begin to address them? Do we have to relive them and process them that way? Do we have to be constantly talking about them? It's really hard when we're working in this field and we don't have a lot of extra time for maybe going to a monastery and meditating however many hours a day. But we do have this beautiful instrument, this beautiful tool, which is our body, that can help us navigate how trauma affects us every day. And it can also help us release that or at least process it in such a way that we can cope and feel okay in our day to day life. So our body doesn't lie to us. It's not that kind of thing. Um, so I want to ask you, what is your basic belief about the way the world works? Is it inherently for or against you? How would you classify your outlook on life? Is it optimistic, pessimistic, or would you describe it as realistic? And when you're thinking of these things, is this worldview expressed through your lived experience? Like, do you have a lot of anecdotes from your experience to back it up and your behaviors? Or is this something that you find is true just cognitively? Is this something that you're just thinking about all the time? So ask yourself again if your identified belief is merely cognitive or if it is reflected in your behavior and therefore your lived experiences. Our bodies, through the nervous system, are in a constant state of working to achieve balance. And when we experience things, we store them in two ways. We can store them as an explicit memory or an implicit memory. And explicit memories are more associated with the cognitive, whereas implicit memories are more associated with the kinesthetic or just primal type responses. So you see here we have long-term memory, and then those are divided up into two different types of memory. Explicit memory or episodic experienced events, those things that we can recall. And then we have semantic knowledge and concepts, so the cognitive part, the things that we learn from books or bigger concepts, ideas, philosophies, etc. Then we have our implicit memory. Those are our procedural skills and actions. Like, for example, when you're driving a car, have you ever taken an exit and been like, whoa, I didn't realize I was that close to this exit? Like, suddenly wake up because you've been driving a car so much it's become rote. And then we also have conditioned emotional responses to things. When X happens, we react like this. So those are also a lot of times more subconscious or unconscious types of reactions. So, our bodies are in a constant state of working to achieve balance, and this is done through homeostasis. So, through homeostasis, our bodies regulate bodily functions. A term maybe less familiar to you is allostasis, or the process through which our body achieves homeostasis through physiological and or behavioral change. So allostasis here, as you can see, allows us to maintain a balance in the body or homeostasis by predicting and reducing the impacts of certain conditions. But it takes a considerable amount of the brain's energy to do this. And if it fails to resolve the uncertainty, the situation may become chronic and result in an accumulation of allostatic load. All long-standing effects of continuously activated stress responses are referred to as allostatic load. Allostatic load can result in permanently altered brain architecture and systemic pathophysiology. So you've all heard that the amount of stress that we experience in our bodies impact our predisposition to disease. So you can see here in this kind of bell curve breakdown from Wikipedia, what may result in really low levels of being stimulated as opposed to the higher levels of stimulation. So, a person's allostatic load is the totality of the stress they are enduring, which places demand on the body to adjust. And we experience that in modern living for many of us, that stress is nearly constant. The majority of us experience what would be called chronic stress or the stress of daily living, losing our keys, traffic jams, computer malfunctions, forgetting our lunch, time management, and even more. Rarely do we experience acute stress or actual imminent threat to our lives. The body's first response to inputs of stress is through the autonomic nervous system, and we'll look at that here. It's divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The SNS, the sympathetic, is responsible for action oriented responses like fight or flight. Its related nerves are located primarily in the thoracic spine. So if you think heart, lungs area, those are the things that are first affected, as well as digestion when our SNS is stimulated. The PNS is in charge of the recovery phases of our lives when energy can be conserved or restored. And it's often referred to as rest, digest, feed, and breed. When we're relaxed, we can do those things. Our energy is not required for much more than that. And the more that the body is imbalanced toward a constant state of action, the less the body can access any type of recovery. And this in turn gives rise to a sense of dis-ease. Get that? Disease, dis-ease in the body. The parasympathetic nervous system, are the related nerves, are located primarily in the cerebral and the lumbar sacral spine. So the top, our neck area, brainstem, and the bottom of our spine. When the body is flooded with experiences of trauma, chronic stress, and microaggressions from daily life and society, it becomes patterned to a certain type of response in order to protect against future perceived threats, whether real or those brought by triggering situations. They most often become unconscious patterns. Some of the patterns we develop in childhood or in response to a particular trauma can become part of one's shadow self, as defined by Jungian psychology. And we'll talk about that just a little more later. And this is why we can feel we have made some sort of functional understanding or even peace with the offense, but we don't see any kind of experience specific easement in the way that we experience it in our current lives. We may still have the responses to triggers, even though we feel like we're at peace with this thing. So if you look in terms of yin and yang here, as you can see in the slide, the SNS can be considered the yang or the masculine, um, active oriented energy, whereas the parasympathetic can be seen as the yin or the feminine aspect, associated also moon and sun. So if these disease making patterns of life, for the most part, are in our unconscious, how do we bring them into our conscious awareness in order to see the change we hope for in our lived experience? We must relearn the language of our body, and we can do that through an idea of embodiment or being in the body. The body then becomes a critical access point for breaking trauma and stress induced patterns of being and finding ease in some instances, and tools for managing unwanted effects in others. This can be done through movement practices that reacquaint us with the body and allow us to have more conscious control of the balance between action and recovery. Therefore, the body becomes a means for soothing the mind as well. So, here we're looking at Carl Jung again. He's one of my favorites to go to when looking at the idea of our development and being in the body in this world. And transcendental types of psychology. And so Carl Jung has said three distinct things that I'm sharing with you here on being in the body. He's saying we suffer very much from the fact that we consist of mind and have lost our body. Through these traumas, to get away from the pain, to get away from the physical response, we often disassociate from our body. We can just feel like we're heads walking around and we ignore the impact on the body. He also says if your life has not three dimensions, if you don't live in the body, if you live on the two-dimensional plane, in the paper world that is flat and printed, as if you were only living your biography, then you are nowhere. You exist nowhere. And he also says here, soul and body are not two things. They are one. Our body is how our soul experiences. They are one and they are in communication. So next we're going to talk about the chakra system, and you may or may not be familiar. Most people have heard the term before, but as a yoga instructor and practitioner, I find that the chakra system is a very accessible scaffolding upon which to build an embodiment practice and to develop an understanding of what can be found, the richness that can be found in our body. So here you see a basic picture of the symbols and the names of each of the chakras and where they are located. The chakra system was first documented, and let me go back here. The chakra system was first documented in writing in the Hindu Vedas around 3,500 or more years ago. Yet some scholars believe that it originated with Aryan invaders of India sometime around the second millennium BCE. The chakras, which is a Sanskrit word for wheel, are used to understand the function of the energy centers in the physical and subtle body. They also have corresponding nerve plexus regions at each of the main seven, as well as fascial bands. So, correlating fascial bands in our fascia. One of the teachers who has helped make the chakra system familiar in the Western world, her name is Anodea Judith, defines them as so: centers of activity for the reception, assimilation, and transmission of life energies. They correspond to the physiological systems in the body, and you can find these charts with a simple Google search, as well as psychological foundations, which is something that I'm very interested in with this presentation. The primary seven can be thought of as moving from within the central nerve ganglia in the spinal column, as you can see illustrated here. Regardless of spiritual beliefs or none in particular, the chakra system provides a good background for understanding how energies are stored and processed by the body for those who do not want to get bogged down in medical terminology or the science behind that, because there is science to back that up. And you can also Google about that and spend hours learning. But you can begin the work right now with the body while learning the more detailed science of the things like the nervous system, fascia, and the physiological impacts of trauma if you desire. However, we do need to talk a little bit about science to get an idea of what we are talking about now. So let's look at the next slide. We should take into consideration here Einstein's first law of thermodynamics. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Energy can only be transferred or changed from one form to another. So we are constantly utilizing energy and we are constantly changing that energy into form. Like, for example, when you write on a page, you're changing that energy from something that's in your brain, through your hand, through your pen, to the paper, to words that can be read by someone else. So it's an exchange of energy in that way. Einstein also offered us the equation E equals mc squared. And the basic understanding that life in material form is simply a specific combination of energy and mass. Mass is derived from energy. So, if we consider deeply these two ideas together, we can realize the power that we have to manipulate our own experience of life through becoming more conscious of the energies within our bodies and how we are using them every day without labeling them as positive or negative. And pardon my dog barking. There are seven primary chakras, and you can see them here, that influence the everyday experiences of our lives. These chakras can house energies that can be overactive, underactive, or blocked to the flow of energy. As we go through the chakra ladder, you may correlate ideas from the likes of Rudolf Steiner and others who wrote about developmental psychology. And let's take a look at Rudolf Steiner for just a second in case you aren't familiar with him. He divided human development into distinct 7-year periods. So, for example, the ages of 0 to 7 is represented by the idea of will, where you come from parent to personhood, or the life that your parents give you to the life that you want for yourself. The next 7 years, 7 to 14, is when we become feelers or we begin experiencing our emotions more readily. And then from 14 to 21, that's termed thinking, when our psychic development is also very much informed by our budding sexuality. From 21 to 42, we start to develop our sentient, intellectual, and consciousness soul. And then from 42 to 49, our soul works to begin to express itself and its fullness to the world. And it continues on, as you'll see, just like this ladder here, into more spiritual aspects and belief systems and intuitions here. You will also notice that there are other spiritual practices and ideas that can also be correlated, like the Christian sacraments. As we go through each of these, you can take one of the sacraments and apply them to the ideas of that chakra. And it's really interesting if you look that up. Also, the Kabbalistic tree of life, there's 10 of those, if I'm not mistaken. And some of them can be put together to also correspond here with the seven chakras. And that can be easily found also with a Google search, how that goes. So the system is divided here, as you can see, and I'll use the pointer, into this lower triangle and this upper triangle here. And the lower triangle includes three chakras representing what we perceive as workable or tangible reality. Then you've got the bridge here that's formed by the heart center. Then you have the three upper chakras that are associated with the ideas of cognition and spirituality. Let's look here. Let's discuss the chakras very briefly. And there's so much more that you can learn. The Muladhara chakra, or the root chakra, it's our sense of safety, belonging, and security. It's where we learn our first impressions of the world through the community and the family of origin into which we are born. So, our basic sense of safety and where we belong in the world. And it's located at the base of the spine, around the tailbone. Also includes our legs. Then we have the Svadhisthana chakra, or the sacral chakra, the home of creativity, where we begin to relate to others as individuals, our interpersonal relationships. So it's located in the pelvis area, or the area in front of and around the sacrum in our pelvic bowl. Then we have the Manipura chakra, or the solar plexus. That's where we develop our personal power, focus, and will, where we begin to identify as an individual in our relationship with self. So you can see in the graphic here, there are words that we can use to help us remember the chakras, like Muladhara, we feel safe; Svadhisthana, creative; Manipura, strong. So then we get to, of course, loved, which is the heart center; Anahata, and again associated with love. the ability to love and be loved, sharing our heart with the world. So, as we go through these, you can probably see that correlation with Steiner's ideas of human development already here. And then as we climb, the next one is the Vishuddha chakra or the throat center, the ability to express our truth in our unique voice. So the word associated there in the graphic is expressive. Moving up, we have the Ajna chakra, the third eye, the ability to make our connection to source tangible. So our intuition and logic as well is associated there. And a lot of times people don't see intuition and logic as something to meld, but it is very much so. One deeply informs the other. And then we have the Shashara or the crown chakra, connection to source and divinity. And I've heard different pronunciations of this one, so you may pronounce it differently there, but that's where we connect to our idea of the divine. And even if we don't have an idea of a higher power, we can connect to the thought of a purpose that's bigger than an individual. We can connect to the idea of science being able to explain the world. It's really a beautiful thing. So here, as you can defer, the possibilities can go from surface levels of inquiry to really deep levels of inquiry, depending on the intentions behind the exploration of using the chakra system as a model. Each of the chakras you can have journal prompts for. There are yoga asanas for each of these chakras. You can build an entire practice around using the chakras in this way. So now let's look at applicable shadow. So, through the efforts with embodied and somatic practices, we can turn what can be deemed shadow energy into energy that can be applied to our life's goals, work, and purpose. So, what is shadow? As Carl Jung stated here, the shadow is to be the unknown dark side of the personality. According to Jung, the shadow, in being instinctive and irrational, is prone to psychological projection, in which a perceived personality inferiority is recognized as a perceived moral deficiency in someone else. So we all have these aspects and can project these feelings as something that we see as a big deal in another person. So all the parts of yourself that you don't want to admit to yourself or others that you have. And it's really interesting too because in the psychology of Kundalini Yoga, which is a book that has been created around notes from the seminar given in, I think it was 1932 by Carl Jung, uh, he talks about the chakras and how we can use the chakras to look at shadow work and many other things. So he says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. If we don't, you don't know what you don't know, if you understand that in a way. And again, our bodies can really help us to know what we don't know, to learn what we don't know, to discern and to recognize. And then he says also, I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. So it's what we choose to do with our experiences that matters in the end. How do we let them guide or inform our lives? Going back to the first law of thermodynamics, we can begin to create a container that will help us safely access the energies we may currently experience as impacting us in an undesirable fashion. Through embodied practices such as yoga, meditation, or pranayama, breath work, mantra, and other embodied movements, we can begin to bring a balance to them, introducing new patterns and alchemizing those no longer useful to us. These practice these practices, coupled with in-depth personal inquiry, can assist us in a complete understanding and acceptance of ourselves as we are, so that we are free to make changes. So let's look at some of these embodiment practices that I have listed here. And I won't go over them all, but feel free to explore on your own, taking these names, plugging them in, researching them for yourself. But we look at embodiment practices through research, and research is proving that many practices now being referred to as embodied and or somatic practices can serve to bring balance back to the body by working with both sides of the autonomic nervous system, both the SNS and the PNS. They both need work, and particularly allows us to access our PNS. They give us an opportunity to safely experience the body again after long standing disassociation. That can be really, really intimidating. And if we don't want to have to recall traumatic memory, we can go to the body and have that cushion sometimes of feeling, just feeling rather than overthinking something. So here we see dissociation is a mental process where a person disconnects from their body, thoughts, feelings, or memories, and even so much so that they can disconnect from their sense of identity. So yoga can be an embodied practice for us in that it asks us in many ways to minutely experience our body. To, for example, to be in your legs in Warrior One, to feel the strength of the pose, to also, if you're practicing with intention, you know, my body as a prayer, it can become a really beautiful way for us to experience what we're experiencing in a safe environment on our mat. It's regulated for us through our breath, through our movement, through how we're choosing to move and access our body. And like I said before, you can have specific chakra related yoga practices. Each of the asanas can be related to a particular chakra or multiple chakras. This is the same for dance, and you can see how that would be related to moving the body, to moving energy through, to using the body as an expression of feeling in its movement. You have meditation and journaling. You can journal about each of the chakras. Yoga Nidra I put as a separate topic here, and it can also be correlated with one on the right hand side there, inhabiting the body, which is a practice taught by Judith Blackstone, where you go into each body part individually and try to hone your experience there, to breathe that part, to live that part, to be in that part. Martial arts, again, another movement tool. Body yawn, working in various movements that are known to relax the nervous system and can create like spontaneous stretching or pendulation, also actual yawns. You have the unconditional model that can also be looked up here. Another one that is newer on the scene and one that I personally became certified in is Merge the Practice, developed by Crystal Palermo and Eric Toer. And it is specifically geared toward fascial opening and healthy fascia. And thinking of fascia, which is defined as an emotional organ in our bodies now, learning how it helps us to move, learning how it communicates with the brain and through our muscles. And again, if you remember, each of the chakras have correlating fascial bands. And merge ideas can be put into any movement practice. Um, and I use it with my yoga teaching as well as weightlifting. And then you have body stories, which, if for some reason you're restricted in movement, starting working with body stories might be a good place to begin. And this one is as described or utilized by Dr. Ray Johnson. And they define it as this: body stories are narratives of the subjective, felt experience of our own bodies as told from the inside out. They convey our body's history, significant events, symbols, images, and unique patterns and preferences. And they are not about the body. but are told from the body. The body is the subject of inquiry, always works in process. And they have developed a book called Body Stories, Embodied Narratives as Inquiry and Integration. And you can find that um, also through Amazon or a Google search. So I just want to take a moment to thank you for listening to this presentation. And if you have any questions, you can find me on Facebook or Instagram. My full name is Kelly Hansel Haywood, and I welcome any feedback from you. So thank you for joining me today. I also teach workshops and various things on these topics, so I also welcome any inquiry about that for your uh, purposes. So thank you for your time. Have a good day, evening, wherever you are in your day. Thank you and goodbye.